Hello, this is another in the series of Druidic rambles about various different issues. For once I'm not in the kitchen and I'm not cooking, that's largely because my brain has collapsed in on itself and I'm just not with it. So I'm sitting down instead and waffling. The thing I thought I would waffle about this time, which has emerged from 2 or 3 conversations I had with various different people over the last couple of weeks, sort of a theme, if you like, that's ongoing, is the issue of truth, particularly truth in language. It's something that since the romantic revival of Druidry back in the late 17th, 18th centuries, when groups of Welsh nationalists and Irish revivalists and so on were meeting together to re-energise the image of a druid as this sort of noble Celtic spirit existing in the face of oppressive English parliaments and various other forces. One of the particularly influential people, Iolo Morganwg, promoted the idea of truth as a great Druidic concept, and there are various phrases that get bandied around, truth against the world and so on, to emphasise this notion that the Druids were particularly passionate in upholding the truth, which they may well have been in ancient times, perfectly possible that they were. But I want to run with that from a more current 21st century point of view and not pick up on every issue, because I think I can probably milk this into a couple of broadcasts, frankly. But when we communicate, we have a shared language. Ludwig Wittgenstein was very, very keen on this and went on about it at some length, if not always in the most comprehensible way, ironically enough. But one of his arguments is that truth and language are interrelated in that language reflects the truth of the world. You see a table and you talk about the table, and when you think about a table, you're discussing it. The word table conjures up in your imagination an idea, an image, a picture. He talked about picture theory, this notion that it produces a picture in your head, what a table is, and if you're having a conversation with somebody else and you say, "Oh, I bought a table yesterday," that immediately puts into their head, their imagination, the concept of a table, the image, the picture. Of course, the image of the table they visualise might not be the table you actually bought, which is the visual image you've got in your head. You're thinking of a very particular table. They may have an image of a somewhat generic table, which kind of overlaps with some of the ideas of Plato and the theory of forms and this idea that we have kind of template images in our mind, which Plato argued to emanate from sort of spiritual dimension, as to what. So you say the word dog, people conjure up an image of an idealised dog. I hesitate to use the word stereotypical because these days that has lots of negative baggage to it, but people will have an immediate image leap to their mind of a particular type of dog, which might be influenced by their experience of dogs and all that kind of thing. To a point, of course, this is very, very true. An awful lot of language does conjure up visual imagery. How that works for someone who has been blind from birth, who doesn't have the visual imagery, I have to admit I personally don't know. That's not a conversation I've ever had with a blind person, but maybe that would be worth factoring in, because not everyone is going to have a visual imagination. Some people might think in a very different way when words are said to them, and it conjures up other imagery, let alone, of course, conversations with people who are deaf are using sign language. But even there, you could say the gestured hand sign language is still conjuring up probably visual images of the things that are being referred to by hand gestures. So that one would probably fit reasonably well with Wittgenstein's argument. There are, of course, lots of words for things that are not physical objects. Whilst there are words for trees and glasses and cups and tables and chairs and floorboards, there are also words for lots of abstract things, love and hate, inspiration, God, big grand words that could mean, well, a whole raft of things, but very rarely something physical, very rarely something concrete. Or you say God to somebody and they might immediately think old man, big white beard and 90 sitting on a cloud. Perhaps they do have a visual image, something hijacked from Zeus, but a lot of other people might that word might promote a more abstract concept, a much less visual conception of what that means when it's said to them. One of the necessities of communication is that when I say a word, and I'm talking to another person, that what I mean by that word is the same as what the other person means by that word. Otherwise, we're going to be talking at cross purposes. So, visual aid. This is Boris. If Boris says, pass me a hazelnut, and there are a variety of different nuts in the bowl, and I look in the bowl, and what Boris means by a hazelnut is also what I think of as a hazelnut when I hear that word. I will reach into the bowl, pick out the nut, give it to Boris, and Boris will be very happy that he has got exactly what he has wanted. However, supposing I don't speak a word of English, supposing I only speak Japanese or something, and I've got absolutely no idea what the word hazelnut means because I don't speak English. He can say that word, but it will have no significance to me. In fact, he can be waffling away in English 9 to the dozen, and all I'm going to hear is blah, 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 blah. None of it's going to mean anything to me. If you use the Japanese word for a hazelnut, I don't know what that is, but whatever it is, then we'd have the capacity to communicate. Supposing even, however, we both speak English, but when he says hazelnut, he means that. But for some obscure reason, I don't quite know why, but let's say for some obscure reason, when I hear the word hazelnut, I immediately think of one of these things. It's an almond if your eyesight isn't very good. So he asks for what he wants, I give him what I think he's asked for, he's very unhappy, and we miscommunicate. Therefore, language needs to be shared, have shared meaning. At one level, you could argue that is the truth of language, that what I mean when I use a word is the same thing that the listener, the hearer, understands by that word. We have a shared truth. That's not to say that truth has any massive significance in the world, any huge objective reality to the rest of existence. So I could say pixie, somebody else understands pixie, we have a shared truth. Does that mean, therefore, pixies genuinely really do exist? Well, not necessarily. They might, but the mere fact that we share a word for it isn't automatic proof that pixies do exist. We know hazelnuts exist, though. So we've got to have a shared conception. Now, if we're just talking about hazelnuts, it's mildly interesting, but does it really matter to anyone at the end of the day? It becomes potentially more heated when we get onto personal issues, because we then move from a single tier of truth, either this is a hazelnut or it isn't, to a dual level of truth. Supposing I say, I am a wizard. I've got a beard, you know. And I'm having a conversation with somebody else, with him, and I say to him, I am a wizard. I mean something by the word wizard. He's heard the word wizard. He has an understanding of what the word wizard means. Now, let us say that his understanding of what the word wizard means is the same as my understanding of what the word wizard means. You with me so far? That's the first tier of truth, that we both know what we're talking about when we use that word. Boris and I are in agreement. However, there is a subtle difference between saying this is a hazelnut and I am a wizard. The subtle difference is that he might agree with me about what a wizard is, but that doesn't mean he agrees that I am a wizard. He might think I'm a nutjob. He might be utterly unconvinced by my claims of wizardry, because that is a second tier of truth. The first tier is knowing what the word means. The second tier is agreeing it's being applied correctly. Do I have the right to call myself a wizard? Does he believe me? He may think, yes, I really am a wizard, got the hair, got the beard. Or he may think I'm a complete Fruit Loop and I have no conception of I'm making a ludicrous claim, I'm clearly not a wizard at all, and I'm very, very misguided. Will I take huge offence of that? Well, possibly. Obviously, people don't often get into these sorts of heated debates about who's a wizard and who's not. However, if you want to apply that to much more personal issues, I wouldn't go too far into this because we could walk into some very dodgy territory, but when it comes to issues of gender, issues of race, issues of religion, a variety of other issues as well, somebody might say, I am this thing. They state that word to an audience, whoever it is that they're talking to. The person listening engages in that two-tier of truth. In the first instance, they have to understand what the word means when that person says, I am a woman, I am Asian, I am a Baptist. What does that word mean? At one level, that's the first tier of truth, that they both understand the meaning of the word. However, when somebody says, I am, fill in the blank, the other person moves to that second tier. Okay, in that I know what the word means, fair enough, but do I think you are it? Second tier. One of the recent shifts, part of it is a result of the huge enthusiasm out there for identity politics, is a shift to self-defined truth from objectively defined, well, objective, that's the wrong word, shared definitions of truth. At one level, that does exist with hazelnuts and this sort of thing. Is this a hazelnut just because I think it is a hazelnut? Or do we have to have a collective agreement with other people? I think if I showed this to 99.9% of the English-speaking world and said this is a hazelnut, 99.9% of them would go, yes it is. There might be the odd person who goes, oh no, it's not, but practically everybody's going to say yes it is. Because we have an agreed definition of what a hazelnut is. Do we have an agreed definition about more nebulous terms? So if somebody says, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Druid, I'm a whatever, there are working definitions of what those things mean. But there are also quite frequently conflicting definitions of what those things mean. So somebody says, I'm a Buddhist. Well, are you a Mahayana Buddhist? Are you a Theravada Buddhist? Are you this, that, the other? What shade of Buddhist are you? Do you mean you're a Buddhist monk? Do you mean you're a Buddhist lay practitioner? You can get into sort of branchings off as to exactly what that word means, and there might be somewhat different interpretations. So a Theravadan Buddhist defines it this way, Mahayana Buddhist defines it that way. There's room for debate. So even at that first tier, you can often get quite complex definitions as to exactly what it is that somebody else is talking about. And it can get very heated, it can get very personal. The second tier definition is to some extent an issue of gatekeeping. Who decides who is a Catholic, who is a Buddhist, who is a Hindu, who's a socialist, who's a conservative? Is there somebody who acts as a rubber stamper, as it were, who says, right, you're fair enough, you are a Baptist, but no, you're not at all. Someone who will arbitrate as to whether or not this particular person has the right to claim that identity, membership of that social group. Some labels, I don't like that word, but some social groupings have structure, have hierarchies, and there are people in those hierarchies whose job it is to say yes or no. The Catholic Church is a very, very good example of that. It's got a long, well-established hierarchy. It's got lists of central beliefs, things that you definitely must subscribe to if you're a Catholic, and there are other beliefs that are a bit more peripheral even, and, well, a lot of Catholics believe them, but you don't absolutely have to believe this, this and this, but you definitely do have to believe this, this and this. And obviously you've got bishops and archbishops and cardinals and what have you, who can act in a role of saying to somebody who turns up at a church, either yes, you are a registered, signed on the line, card-carrying Catholic, or no, sorry, you're a bit confused, whatever it is that you believe in, well, that's not really Catholicism, and you either need to change what you believe, or there's the door, please don't come back. There is a sense of regulation for some identities. Other identities might be more given. Gender is a good example of that one. We tend to look at a baby and think, oh, that's male, that's female, whatever, and provide an identity, and then that's reinforced throughout the child's life, whether when they get to slightly older age, whether they agree with a label everyone else has assumed of what they are, that's a separate point again. But a lot of assumptions tend to be made about a lot of types of identity, things that we assume are biological, but which perhaps are not quite necessarily always as biological as we think they are. So there can be a degree of acquiring an identity because everyone else keeps telling you you've got it, not because you made any great effort to go out and acquire that identity. You didn't try to join up, you were just told you are by default a member of this group, and probably most of the time we go, oh, fair enough, and that becomes part of our identity. We don't question that very often. Other identities you more have to actively seek out. So religious conversion, or joining some political movement that is not part of your family heritage. So you weren't brought up hearing it. You've at some point in your adolescence or adult life, you've heard these ideas, you've become enamoured of them, and you've gone out and you've signed up and you've read about it. You've joined that political party or whatever it might be. Some ideas are actively sought out. Those kinds of ideas can sometimes have gatekeepers and regulations, in that you might have somebody who pays to become a member of the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats or the Republicans in America or whatever it might be, and say, I want to join this party. You could hold those same beliefs without obviously necessarily buying a membership card. There's a sort of a subtle difference that you can believe a thing without necessarily actually being a paid up member of a particular organisation representing it. So whilst the person who keeps the membership list could say, well, actually you haven't, according to my membership list, you haven't actually signed up to join the Labour Party, therefore you're not a member, you could nonetheless still hold those values, those beliefs, those ideals. If you were a paid up member and you started espousing beliefs not in keeping with that party, then you could potentially get the order of the boot and be told that your definition of that word, Labour voter, Tory voter, whatever it might be, is no longer in keeping with the accepted definition, and that whoever it is that keeps the membership rolls, their job is to act as gatekeeper and say, this is what this word means, this is the truth of this identity. To be a member, a paid up member of this organisation, you have to believe X, Y and Z and do this and behave in that way. You haven't, sorry mate, you're out. That is their job. The person facing the boot might protest, they might say, no, I really, really think that as a member of this party I should be allowed to believe this and do that, and so on. And they may genuinely believe that. But there is someone who has the role of saying yes or no. Your definition is the correct one, or no, it's not. There are other identities which are much looser. The pagan religions is a very, very good example of it. You could be a member of a particular group, the Pagan Federation, some particular coven, or the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids or whatever, and you are expected to meet a certain standard of behaviour or espouse a certain set of beliefs in order to be a member of a registered membership list group. And either you are a member or you're only pretending that you're a member. So there is that. But when it comes to more general labels, Druid, Heathen, Wiccan, Kemetic, you don't necessarily have to be a member of some specific group that meets on a regular basis to call yourself one of those things. And that's when we get into this kind of interesting area of whether truth then becomes an internal matter or a shared matter. So if somebody says that they are a Druid, what does that mean? Lots of people have different understandings of what the word Druid means, sometimes quite radically different, even conflicting understandings of what that word means. So let's say Boris comes along and says, I'm a Druid, and then proceeds to tell us what he means by that term Druid. And he's telling that to me and perhaps a few other people. Let's say I listen to his definition, I think, what a load of rubbish, that's not what Druid means to me. Do I own the truth of that word, or does he own the truth of that word, or neither of us, perhaps, or maybe even both of us to some extent? So if he means one thing and I mean a totally different thing by the same word, when we both say, I'm a Druid, we are not saying the same thing, because he means one thing, I mean another. And if we're having a conversation with a third person entirely, they're going to get very confused about what the hell it is we're talking about, because we're both using the same word to mean different things. Given that there is no Archbishop of Druidry, there is no hierarchy comparable to the sort of thing you get with the Catholic Church. You don't have to be registered. It's not like becoming a doctor where you go on a list and you can get struck off for not doing the right things. There is no one widely agreed upon definition of what that word means. So to some level, his definition and my definition are as good as each other. Maybe he's the only person in the world who has that particular definition. Maybe there are 10,000 people who would agree with me and no one at all agrees with him. Does it matter? In a world where an awful lot of things are self-defined, and I would argue that certainly 21st century Western Europe has become very much in favour of self-definition, you could say, well, everyone's definition is fine, everyone's definition is acceptable, his definition is as good as my definition, as good as anybody else's definition. Let's all be nice together and have tea and cakes and not argue anymore. If only it was that simple. What happens if you've got loads and loads and loads of definitions of the same word is that communication becomes extremely difficult. Because we're all having conversations theoretically using the same words, the same language, but actually meaning totally different things by it. And therefore, anyone else trying to take part in that conversation is going to get very, very confused, because they're trying to keep track of 30, 40, 50 definitions of the same word, and people using it in all sorts of different ways. And knowing what on earth it is the other person is actually talking about can become quite challenging, not to say occasionally impossible. To have conversation, to have communication, you need some agreement as to what language means. At first tier level. The second tier level, does he have, let's say I agree with his definition of Druid, that still doesn't mean I necessarily agree that he deserves to use the word Druid. I might think he doesn't meet up to that definition. He's not doing whatever it is he should be doing, or believing whatever it is he should be believing. I might query the validity of his claim to that word. To an extent, anyone can query anything. That's just human existence. Anyone can ask questions, no matter how awkward or challenging or potentially rude those questions might be. Is it my place to question whether Boris really is what Boris says he is? That might depend on what happens next. In as much as if Boris says, oh, I'm a Druid and I can conduct your wedding ceremony, well, then suddenly, actually, it does start to affect me, because if he just says I'm a Druid and sits in a corner, it has no impact on my life whatsoever, then no, it doesn't really matter. But if he's going to do something, or say something, or maybe he goes off and axe murders half a dozen people, gets in the newspapers and creates this terrible bad image for anyone who uses the word Druid, then suddenly his definition is starting to impact on me. And when people go and do horrendous things and acts of terrorism or horrible abuses, or they go and rob the pearl box in the church or something, then it's quite common for people to say, oh, they weren't a real Christian, they weren't a real Muslim, they weren't a real this, a real that, a real the other. And you get into those no true Scotsman arguments that no real Christian would do that, no real Buddhist would do that, therefore if they've done it, they can't be real. It's not a helpful argument to suddenly wash your hands of someone when they've done something a bit crappy and say, well, they can't possibly be a real member, because just because they're falling short of the ideal doesn't mean that they weren't a member of your movement, your organisation, or possibly even remain a member of your movement or organisation, just because you don't like what they're doing or what they're saying. To what extent is consensus and agreement required for the language of identity? Does it matter if I don't agree with Boris's self-definition as a druid or whatever it is that he's claiming to be? Does he need me to agree with him? Well, there might be occasions when he does. If he wants me to engage in some activity with him that's related to his identity, or if his identity, let's say he get hospitalised and he wants to access a particular chaplain, maybe only people whose religious identity is agreed upon by the chaplain can get the chaplain, and then suddenly it matters what the chaplain thinks, because officialdom has crept into something, and then somebody else agreeing, yes, you are what you think you are, starts to have an influence. If it's an entirely internalised matter, probably nobody else's opinion much counts one way or the other. But there are occasions when somebody else's understanding of who you are can have quite a big impact on your life. So to what extent does there need to be a consensus on words like druid or any of the other quite abstract words that we might be using in Druidry and well, not just Druidry, paganism in general? That's where I find it gets interesting, and I'm not offering any answers on this one because I'm not wholly sure what the answers are, to be quite honest. This is something I'm mulling over myself to a large extent. Within not just Druidry but the pagan movements at a larger extent, we are not madly keen on gatekeeping, let's put it like that. Whereas in some other religions and political movements and other sorts of organisations, as already mentioned, talking about the Catholic Church and political parties and things like that, there are people in positions of authority who can say, well, this label means such and such a thing, and those people over there, they are members of our group, but those people over there, they're not. We don't know who they are. They can allow access in or bar access from official membership of a group and official claim to use the word in a way that has this agreed upon truth to it. We're not mad keen on having individuals do that in the various different pagan movements. Is that a stumbling block? Is it some people laud it as a great strength. Others might question whether actually it is a stumbling block, in that if you don't keep out the really peculiar, and by peculiar I'm talking the quite dangerous, not just slightly weird, but people who are an absolute menace, are you then just, by having no gatekeeper, throwing the doors wide so that you can get all sorts of quite frightening, quite dangerous, quite high-risk individuals laying claim to an identity, and there is no one who is in a position to say, well, I'm sorry, but actually you're not what you claim to be. You're just deluded or dishonest or confused or whatever word you want to use to suggest that that person should not be a member of the group, is not providing the service, the function they claim to be providing. So, for example, putting that in maybe slightly more practical terms, If you got someone who puts in a truth claim to have healing powers, they say, well, I've studied this, that, the other healing technique, I can treat your condition, massage, aromatherapy, reflexology, whatever the thing is. Clearly there are going to be people who have gone through all of the training, done everything, qualified, got the certificates, pinned them on the wall, and are fantastic healers. There are going to be other people who may be sent off 2 labels from the top of a cereal packet, got a certificate off of a dodgy group on the internet, have read half a chapter of one book about that therapeutic technique, and frankly shouldn't be let within half a mile of anyone who is genuinely in need of medical treatment. People who should not be claiming to have knowledge and expertise of a thing because clearly they don't have it. If it's a case of claiming I've completed a course, I've got a certificate, yes, there is a sort of what either you have or you haven't about it. There's a practical level to it. But a lot of people might claim to have healing powers without any particular training or particular certification, that they just have, sort of healing influences, and they can lay on their hands and treat conditions, do this, do that, do the other. Some of them, maybe they can, I don't know. But it opens the possibility that you're going to get people making false claims, either because they are just dishonest, or because they want to lay on hands in an ever so slightly creepy way, or because they are just very deluded and self-important and think they are capable of things that actually they're not capable of. And if they are presenting themselves as having a capacity they don't have to individuals who might be unwell, who might be vulnerable in a variety of different ways, you've clearly got an opportunity for exploitation and abuse to take place in that sort of a condition. Do we then get into some quite difficult, quite challenging areas in which maybe there is a need for gatekeeping, for individuals to say either you do or you don't? Does that necessitate organisation? Some kind of a structure to set up that regulates an understanding of what things are, or is that just stultifying hierarchy, opening the doors to a whole different style of abusive behaviour? Because for a lot of people, their sense of being excluded from something, told that they're not doing it right, they can't join the club, as it were, can be very, very oppressive. And you can cite all sorts of cases in history where that power has been used in a very unfortunate way, a very harmful way to some individuals, which I suspect is half the reason why modern paganism is very resistant, because they've seen it go wrong and they don't want to go there again. One of the other aspects that Wittgenstein explored, touch a little bit on it at the moment and maybe come back to this in some other podcast in the future in more depth, is the notion of linguistic determinism, that the way we use language shapes the way we think about things. That's certainly at the root of a lot of modern political thinking. It has sort of language issues where certain words are deemed inappropriate, racial slurs and rude words about people's sexuality and that kind of thing, on the notion that words that are deemed hostile or insulting or what have you, if they're used repeatedly by an individual, can shape the way they think about the group of people they're talking about or referring to. So if you get used to using angry language, the argument is rather that not only is it upsetting to the people you're using the language against, but it can shape your own attitude to them. It can make you more hostile than you were to start with by repeated use of language. It's not a clear-cut one, because you're always getting into the situation where a word that upsets one person does not upset the person sitting next to them. And so one person wants that word censored, and the next person couldn't care less whether it's used or not. So it's never a nice, straightforward, clear-cut, don't say this, always say that. Because even where a word is approved of, not everyone's going to like the word the word that Joe Bloggs likes hearing used isn't necessarily the word that Joe Bloggs' neighbour likes hearing used. So there's lots of difficulties there, but it is a commonly held notion that the way we talk about ourselves, the way we talk about other people, the way we discuss certain ideas, certain issues, the words themselves have a power to either give a positive view of a thing or give a very negative view of the same thing. To some extent, that resonates with a lot of pagan concepts. Certainly, if we're thinking from an Egyptian Kemetic point of view, the notion of words having great magical power is central to Egyptian belief. Not in the politicised way it's become in the 21st century, but this notion of words as magical power is central to that. Would not wholly surprise me, trip back in time to the Druids of 2,000 odd years ago, I can easily imagine them thinking something quite similar, given what little we know about the attitudes to poetry and words and the power of words and the power of speech, that they probably had some kind of notion around that themselves as well. There are critics, quite a lot of critics, of linguistic determinism who say it's not the word, it's more the tone. In that you can say, two people could say the same word, and from one of them it sounds really funny and nice and pleasant, and the next person it sounds really angry and bitter and furious and frustrating. So you might have rulings that, you can't possibly say this word anymore, that's a very old-fashioned word. You must now say this new word, which is socially acceptable, instead. And within about 5 minutes, school children start using that new word as an insult. Gay is a good example of that from, let's say, homosexual, which, if you go back a few generations, was a more common word to use, but a lot of people find it sounds very medical. It sounds almost like you're referring to a kind of something clinical, and therefore gay becomes the more acceptable word, and, oh God, you're so gay, becomes an insult in the playground. So the same word can be used positively or negatively, and it's the tone of voice, the attitude, the look of homicidal mania on the face of the person who's saying it that gives you a sense of whether they are about to kill you or whether they are being friendly and nice and kind and what have you. So it's that argument that it's not the word, it's the intent. That perhaps has more resonance, pagan-wise, with a more Wiccan approach, which has the idea that within magic it's not so much the words and the colours of the candles and this and that, as the intent of the individual engaging in some mystical act, healing or whatever the thing might be. Intent has a huge role to play in modern Wiccan understandings. So there's sorts of interesting divergences of opinion on how we understand language, how we use it. Does language shape how we think? Not just in terms of whether you're allowed to say this or that word about another type of human being, rude words or flattering words or what have you, but also, and this is perhaps something that we will pick up on in another one because we'd be here forever otherwise, if you're following a form of paganism that's rooted in a culture, so Druidry, rooted in Welsh culture, Irish culture, Scottish culture, etc. You could speak words in English, or you can look to words in those languages, in Welsh, in Irish, in Cornish, and so forth. You'll often find words that are not easily translatable into English, or French, or whatever your mother tongue is that you more commonly speak in. And some people will learn, if they're not born in Wales and they don't already speak Welsh, they might choose to learn Welsh. They can conduct ceremonies in Welsh or ceremonies in Irish. And within other traditions, there are people heathens who look to learn Anglo-Saxon so they can conduct bloats and bloat rituals in Anglo-Saxon or Old Norse or whatever language they choose to, with the sense that language is powerful. By learning the words of another language and speaking to their gods in that language, occasionally speaking to other human beings in that language, in ceremony or what have you, the other language has its own resonances, its own power, its own way of shaping thought and understanding of the world. It has its own world view, which again is something that Wittgenstein went on about at some length, the Weltanschauung, the worldview, the understanding of how a language shapes the way you think about the world. And so if you are looking to practice ritual to get into a ritual mindset, does it matter? And I'm not answering this one, I'm just posing it as a question. Does it matter the language you use? Because if, let's say, you're a native English speaker, for argument's sake, if you speak in that language, but you conduct, on a day-to-day basis, but you conduct your ritual and ceremony in Welsh, in Proto-Brittonic, in Gaulish, in ancient Egyptian, whatever language you want to choose, do you shift into another mind space when you use that other language? Because the words in that language, the meaning, the subtext, the symbolism, the nuances of that language are significantly different. So it's not just learning what the Anglo-Saxon word for hazelnut is. It's the idea that there will be words, concepts in one language that are nigh on impossible to translate into another language, which actually change how you think about a whole raft of issues. Within theological areas, you can look at words that mean God or are claimed to mean God in a variety of different languages. The question becomes, when we use the word God in English, is that exactly the same thing as, let's say, Netja in ancient Egyptian, which is the word associated with the gods, the deities? Are those just the same word in two different languages? Is that same word in two different languages? Or are they actually two different concepts, two different structures? So what God means in English isn't quite what Netja means in Egyptian. It means something subtly different. And therefore, if you're learning about that religion, you learn about the language of that religion, and you acquire, to a greater or lesser extent, the mental outlook, the understanding, the concepts of the universe in that other language. Or is this just a kind of a straight translation issue? Some people are mad keen on learning other languages to use in a ritual context. Other people who struggle with learning languages see it as this sort of insurmountable roadblock and prefer to do it in their own mother tongue, and see it all as a bit pretentious and lovey. It's a bit like, I suppose, the way a lot of Catholics used to go to Latin Mass and didn't speak a word of Latin and didn't half the time have a clue what the priest was on about, but it sounded lovely. And they liked the sound of it, even if they didn't know what half the words meant. For some people, if you're sitting in a religious ritual and you haven't got a clue what the other person's on about because it's in a language you don't speak, for a lot of people that's an exercise in pointlessness. Why are you sitting there listening to something you don't understand? Shouldn't it be in a language you do understand? It's an arguable point, it's an understandable point, but if determinism has any sort of value to it, you could certainly argue that if you do learn the language, if not fluently, at least learn as much as you can learn, then part of it isn't just learning a yet another word for hazelnut, it's learning concepts, notions, ideas, which may not exist in your mother tongue, or may change the way you think about things in your mother tongue. And that's an interesting area in terms of how we understand truth in a language. We move beyond the realm of hazelnuts and tables and chairs and trumpets and harps and what have you, and we start thinking about more abstract notions, more abstract concepts, things that are more nebulous and harder to nail down. Are there notions, emotions, thoughts, feelings, understandings, concepts of entities, beings, spirits, what have you, that only exist in certain languages, and those notions really don't translate across to other languages? And perhaps especially if we're talking about languages that have maybe been dead and largely out of use for hundreds or thousands of years, how easy is it to get into the mindset? I mean, you could learn Latin, you could learn ancient Greek, but would learning a list of words and grammar and syntax and what have you, would that get you into the mindset of an ancient Roman or an ancient Greek? Which is another kind of a counter to the idea of using it in ritual, is that yes, you've learned a few words, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have the same mindset as the people whose language you're using, or whose clothing you're dressing up in. If you're going for a more sort of reenactment element or reconstructive element of recreating the style of ceremony, the style of ritual, the style of dress from 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So a curious area, and something we'll come back to and we'll think more of later. But I think I've waffled on more than enough for the moment, so we'll leave that one there. And if any of you have got particular questions, do ask, because it's nice to know that somebody out there is actually alive and listening. Oh, Morris says goodbye.